everybody, how's it going? Andrew here. I just want to say real quick, if anyone is struggling to define their goals or don't have a plan in place with your game marketing, and because of that, it's making things challenging for you, then take a moment, go to my website, rengenmarketing.com, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my email list. Why? Because doing so will get you delivered right to your inbox a free marketing plan template specifically designed for games. Look, I've already verified recently that 2 college professors have used this in their courses and shared it with their students because they understand the value and how helpful it is for them to plan out what their marketing looks like. What's really awesome is simply the fact that these professors are incorporating marketing and this level of marketing into their courses because, again, they understand the value that marketing plays. So it's really exciting to hear this. But on top of that, lots of other people have utilized this template, have found it really helpful for them to further define their goals and provide them clarity and direction in what they need to do to make things happen with their awareness efforts. So again, if any of this sounds like it could be helpful for you, then please just check out the website, rengenmarketing.com, scroll down, sign up for that email newsletter, and then right to your inbox, you will get that free marketing plan template. So again, can't thank you enough for being such great listeners. And now let's get right to the show. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be discussing how to crush playtesting your games. We all have a tendency to get close to our projects and sometimes miss the forest for the trees, especially when it comes to player feedback. But even if we don't, the playtesting process can be cumbersome and even overwhelming, making it a challenge to navigate and understand what actions need to be prioritized to improve the quality of your game. In this episode, we'll be discussing how you can crush your playtesting with a ton of valuable insights that not only provide you with clarity, but can save you a lot of time, money, and frustration. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Agne. Vitkute, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Wow, that's really funny how that rolled off because I was not planning on saying that, but I just made it rhyme. Anyways, Agne, folks, here is with us. She is the head of publishing relations at Game Round, or otherwise known as G Round. Some of you may be familiar with that. If not, don't worry. We're going to talk about it a little bit more in a moment. But also, she's worked several years in the industry with various other roles, such as, and this is quite cool, like business development, feedback on pitch presentations, industry events. I know a good amount actually with industry events and various facets and capacities. You've also been involved with esports to a degree as well. And for going a little bit back further, you were account manager at Plan of Attack, which is a game marketing agency. So lots of like different types of expertise. And there's one in particular that you worked a little bit too that probably most people don't know about. And what was that one in particular?
So I worked a little bit with explicit adult games publishing. And there's a company called Nutaku. They're owned by very big adult entertainment company. And I was scouting for games, which is amazing experience, going to events and helping developers reskin their games for a different audience.
Yeah.
It was probably my most fun job that I ever had.
Yeah, and it's funny. I'm glad you share that because it's something we often, I would say, don't think about that much in terms of, looking at it from, a marketing and business perspective. And, hey, those are still areas to address and everything else. And how do you, how do you fulfill the needs of that form of entertainment and everything else? So how do you approach that? And so that's really cool because, again, it's not something I think that we think about too often, but still it's interesting to see how it was such a really valuable and fun experience too. So, but yeah, so many different backgrounds and everything. Really cool there. And also, I mean, you've just always had a great background and passion for gaming. Clearly, I mean, your track record shows that, and everything else that you have done. But with that said, outside of, what you have done all this time, what are like some other things that you do in your spare time when you're not working?
Also, one of my favorite things is weightlifting. I really like lifting very heavy weights. But also, I'm starting to make my own games. Well, I started making very bad games quite a long time ago. Now I'm learning to do slightly better games. But we'll see. Maybe I will become a game developer. But I learned Unity for fun. Now I'm learning Unreal since last week. I think I just want to have a deeper understanding of development process so I can help market and like playtesting and all the business side better.
Wow. I love that philosophy and everything. And no, I would have to, sorry, I'm going to correct you here, but I would say you already are a game developer because you've been doing it, right? So no, that's great. And again, I mean, not just to it sounds like to have that sense of accomplishment and to do something a little bit different, but also having a better understanding so everything that you've done up to this point and what you're doing with G-Round now, just to really improve things and make them better and have that clear understanding and communicate those things. It's just really awesome that you're going that extra level to understand those things. So again, really appreciate you sharing all this information, but we want to go a little bit deeper here as we enter our Q Box round, which is just a series of some random questions I've prepared for Agne here today, folks. So with that said, Agne, are you ready for the Q Box round?
I'm very ready.
Excellent. So what's the most common mistake you see devs or studios make with their games?
So there's no one thing that every game makes in terms of game design, but the planning, people underestimate how long it's going to take to develop a feature, and then they're behind, and then they playtest way too late, and then they're behind even more because they see that the feature that was supposed to take 2 weeks is going to take 2 months at least.
So planning. I love that one. Next, what's your main approach to tackling problems?
I guess that's not a surprise, but getting external feedback.
Yep.
Whether it's that's what I recommend to developers, but as well, that's what we do ourselves. We ask for feedback before we even design new services, new features. And that's how I do it myself. When I have a problem, I call my sister, I call my friends, I talk to multiple people so I can solve problems much faster than I would do on my own.
Yeah, and I would say too that part of that process too isn't necessarily just getting information from others, but also just that process of talking through it is probably really rewarding and revealing in itself too. I know I can relate to that as well, but no, that's really cool and good stuff to share and on point and theme with our topic today too. So, and last but not least, a staple here on the show is what game are you playing now?
Right now, I'm playing a lot of Slay the Spire, and I've played so much of it for so long. But this is my in-between game because I really want to play the new God of War, but I know it's just gonna take me 50 hours of my life, and I'm not gonna eat or sleep or do anything else. So I'm not prepared. So I'm just playing Slay the Spire for now. Okay,
no, that's a good go-to. So unlike everyone else, I'm trying to think when this is aired, but probably about a month or so after. But any Zelda in your future?
So I don't have a Switch.
Okay.
I mostly play on PS5 or on PC, and I'm considering maybe at least borrowing a Switch for it.
There you go. Because I mean. Some might disagree that, after a while, too many consoles, can be problematic. I know I have that problem with a lot of legacy ones. They're collecting more dust than I'd like to admit. Anyways, You're right, though. Like, you got it narrowed down. Slay the Spire, and then when you're ready to commit and just starve yourself and be sleep deprived, you're going to play God of War. So awesome. Cool. Well, again, thank you, everything, for sharing that. Oh, and one more thing. We're not going to go into detail about it right now, but there is kind of like a special offer, or not necessarily an offer, but an opportunity for listeners today of this that you can take advantage and consider. That Agne will share a little bit more details later. So please stick around for that. It's a really cool opportunity, quite valuable too. I'm sure Agne can attest to that. But again, she'll share more information about that later. So please stick around to the end, and she will provide you more details about this really cool thing that they have going on for you guys. But that said, let's get into our conversation. And, as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to be talking about how to crush playtesting your game. So with that said, kind of let's just kick things off with something simple and basic here. And that is, what would you define as the main objective of playtesting games?
So there are two objectives. One is to get feedback to improve your game. Any parts of your game could be game design, mechanics, balance. And another one is to verify if your game is fun, verify that your improvements actually improve the game. And verify that it's not only you thinking that the game is cool, but also all the other people thinking that your game is cool.
Nice. And I'm glad it's just so simple. And I know at face value, I mean, these might seem pretty obvious, but like, what types of things would you say, helpful in terms of identifying, what's verified, or is sometimes verifying those things as important as realizing that, other things that might surface that didn't verify things for you?
So verification is very important as a continuous thing. So you need to play test multiple times to see if the same people who played it before think it's better, and also new people who never played it before don't find these changes worse or like bad in any way. So I think you need to play this at scale. If you just find one person who doesn't like one thing, it doesn't give you that much value. It's a personal opinion. You cannot please everyone. But that's why you need to verify each and every improvement with multiple people, so it becomes more objective.
Yeah, and I like how you really boiled it down there too, with just simply with the example of like one person versus multiple, and that could be probably applied further with a small data set, small group of people compared to a much larger group of people, because I think that's what it really comes down to, is that comparison is one versus a few or many, and that opposed to like a few versus a many, because that same thing could probably surface and not necessarily verify the things that you need verified, and vice versa, and all these other things that will come out of it. So yeah, no, I appreciate you just quickly breaking that down. And in light of that, through that process, through those two main categories of, playtesting games, I want to kind of discuss some of the challenges. So leading up with this discussion, how would you say developers use playtesting to circumvent rising development costs and competition?
So playtesting can actually cut your development time in a way that you get feedback on features. You know whether you need to cut the features altogether, or better how long it's going to take to develop them. So you have more information when creating your pipeline. So that's why it's very important to get enough data to prioritize the right things. And then once you have the core down, you can either skip whatever is just nice to have, or add additional development time and budget. But when you have limited budget, you need to just make better priorities. And playtesting lets you do that very easily. The earlier you playtest, the better you know what you need to prioritize and how long it's going to take.
So, that's a good point. And you made one, just there saying, the earlier you play test, the better position you're going to be, the more you'll be able to identify, prioritize, what goes into your pipeline, what's going to be too costly, whatever. And that could be helpful with making other future decisions too. Let's say, hey, this isn't going to work. We can release this product in this time frame. Or if we want to do it else, maybe we have like a Kickstarter or some other, or go out for initial seed funding or whatever the case may be. But that said, going back to that point you just made, is there ever a time that's like too early before you start playtesting? Because I'm sure a lot of people might feel that way.
I think it's too early if you don't have a good representation of what the game is. If you have like gameplay that doesn't include major features and all the fun, like if you don't have the fun of it, then it's too early to playtest. But also, like I say that playtesting starts with just showing your concept to your mom, and that's already playtesting in a way. Like it's good to show your game early. Just don't do 1,000 people playtest when you don't have a basic movement done yet.
Right. Oh, yep. Yeah. No, that's really interesting because I know that I've worked with different people in different capacities, and sometimes. There's always that question. It's like, when is it too early? When is the right time to market your game? And there's always questions like, well, it needs to be more polished or earlier. And playtesting, I think, is kind of in a similar boat, but calling out to, basically when it's fun. What's that core mechanic that can get people engaged in everything? And I think as it relates to what I just said, it doesn't necessarily have to be really polished. It doesn't have to have all these other things. Just as long as that core mechanic is fun and you can get really involved with it, then that's probably the right time. Is there any would you say, is there any indication or something that devs could pick up on when they know they struck that core and being fun to play?
Yes. So when you're making your game, you did a playthrough yourself, and you have this little urge to tap someone on the shoulder and be like, look at what I did, like your colleague. That's the time where you show it not only to your colleague, but to someone who's unrelated to the project.
I love how you're able to pinpoint like that exact moment. So folks, like you heard it here from Agne. If you have one of those moments, then you know it's time. And if not, and there's still things in the background that you're kind of questioning, then maybe you need to, iron some things out a little bit. But that is such a great example of when is the right time, because it's really hard to pinpoint that, but wow, you did so very quickly. I love it. All right, so talking about that, I'm also curious too, sometimes teams with larger budgets and everything else might have more resources available and whatnot, but what would you say in terms of how would you recommend smaller studios to go about creating playtesting opportunities?
So it really depends whether you're going with a publisher, investor, or self-publishing. Publishers and investors often have playtesting partners, and they can help you with that. If you're going on your own with zero budget, it will take a lot of man hours to do it. So you need to pre-plan exact questions. You need to have a goal, whether you're testing like gameplay mechanics, features, or art direction, fun, and then you need to find the people. And there are many different ways to find people. If you've released any other games, tap into your old community, even if the game is completely different. If not, there's game jams, just other game development community. They're a lot more biased. We see games differently than regular gamers, but it's definitely a start to showing your game to people that are not your colleagues. Even if it's a big company, it's very bad practice to playtest it within your team, even if with the people that don't work on the game, but they work in the company. You need outside perspective. But students and game jam developers are a very good demographic because they're not that into the game development yet, but they're super interested to be part of it, to know more about game development and all the ins and outs. So they're more willing to participate.
I love how you called out to the fact that asking like colleagues or even people directly in your community that, let's say, or your network that are in the same position as you are probably not going to be the best people to ask. Probably the further out you go, the better perspectives you are potentially getting, especially if they're within your audience. But again, that internally, and I think it's important to maybe make that distinction where when you're developing the game, the concept or whatever, and you get to that moment where you're like, hey, you want to tap someone on the shoulder and like, try this out. That is very different than when you get to the next phase, which is, okay, let's go play test this now. Because I'm sure in that initial moment, you might even default back to that person or other people in that inner circle. And then it just kind of blends in where it's like, oh, you try this out and now we're play testing, but those aren't necessarily the right people to play test, as you called out to. Because a lot of times you're just so ingrained and focused on the project, the insights are going to be kind of in an echo chamber. And it's always the problem that I think that we tend to face with not just this process, but a lot of others too. But I love the fact you called out about game jams, because that is not one that I would have considered, because I would still, and I'm sure maybe other people too, would kind of group that community into the same one as before, as the initial community, part of that echo chamber possibly. But you make an interesting point where it is a different type of player, even though they might be getting into development. It is a player that can offer a lot of helpful insight to this with enough perspective on the outside, but possibly enough insight to provide valuable feedback versus very subjective feedback, which sometimes players can provide, which isn't necessarily helpful.
Yeah, 100%. So it's, I think Game Jam is not like the best way, but it's definitely close to it because it's accessible and people are willing. Otherwise, you need to like talk to influencers, maybe micro influencers, and ask them to invite their communities. It's more like community management, and that takes time. If I could say like, you can do this thing and then you're going to have 500 people in your community, we wouldn't need marketing ever. Like if it was so easy to get hundreds or thousands of people to not only join your community, but also playtest.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in addition to that, you called out another thing, which is really important too, is like influencers, reaching out to them just to play test. Because I just to dig into that deeper, I think that approach provides a lot more, is a better technique or approach, simply because here you have these people that are trying to cater to the masses and they hear feedback all the time about whatever the games they're playing. So they have better insight to what is appealing to their audience. It's like they have a lens of many, understanding of their audience and everything. So when you go to that one person, it's almost like you're pitching it to lots of different people, just all boiled down into this one perspective that makes up an entire audience.
But it is a tricky one because part of marketing is secrecy embargoes and exclusivity deals. Mm-hmm. So if you're very early on and you have your game playtested online and on stream or put on YouTube, you miss out on all these opportunities, including some publishing opportunities. So you need to be very careful with your strategy. This is a great way if you're self-publishing because you will start growing your community through the influencers, especially micro-influencers that either will do it for free or for a lot less money than big influencers. But it won't guarantee NDAs and secrecy that you might need if you're making a bigger game or have a larger publisher.
Yeah. No, great points there, because while influencers can be very helpful in getting valuable feedback, and I'm sure lots of us have heard many different stories on how that can be very applicable, the reality is also that you need to be smart about it. You need to be strategic, because if not, then that could kind of backfire and actually limit other opportunities. You could get maybe you could get some great exposure initially, but then that might thwart any potential beyond that, in later. So all things to be mindful of. But I love how you broke it down. So if we went to three main categories there, well, four, let's say. The main one, don't test within your immediate, your colleagues and things like that. Then old community, if you have one, if there's even if maybe there's not necessarily a good overlap with audiences, probably still worth reaching out to them. Game jams. And then beyond that, probably influencers and any other initiatives that you could take advantage to get more players. I'm sorry, folks, I have to do a quick plug here. G Round is one great place that can happen too. But again, if you're not familiar with it, I know we're going to have time to talk about it a little bit more later. But that said, let's kind of dive in, shift things a little bit here and kind of discuss the whole process around playtesting. And I want to start this section off with, how can developers maximize the value of their playtesting sessions? Because I know there's so much that can go on here, but what are some of the best ways that they can maximize these sessions?
So number one thing you need to do is define your goals. If you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the right answers. Know why you're playtesting. Is it to verify that this feature that you're planning is going to be popular? Is it to see if your game is fun? Is it to see if your controls are intuitive? Define very specific hypotheses that you're testing with playtesting. Then ideally you want to choose a pretty wide audience, especially in the beginning, because if you think that you know your target audience, it's great, but you might miss out on all the other market share that you're just not thinking about. So it's good to test with wider audience, so you know if you're actually, you have a platformer, but maybe you're pretty well rated among puzzle gamers, which you just didn't think about. So you need to know your audience, you need to ask the right questions, you need to collect the data. So one thing is having a playtest like Steam demo, and then where do people go? Do they go to your Discord? Do they go to Steam Community Hub? Be very clear where players need to go to leave feedback and make it very easy for them. Ideally, it's either after the game or you tell them to go on Discord and have a form with questions. Structure your feedback. Have specific questions. So you can ask people to just write reviews, which is great. Then you need to read them. You need to analyze them. You need to categorize them, which is a lot of work, or just ask specific questions. If you have a survey, you will have very specific answers that are already categorized for you. That's the main things. And obviously analyze the data. Don't just look at the reviews. Try to see patterns in those reviews. Try to see what people mention the most. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What is important to your players? Because sometimes you don't even know what is actually fun about your game. You think that this one thing is very cool, but nobody actually noticed it. But they notice all the other things that you didn't think are as great. But then you can use it for your marketing. You can use it for pitching publishers if you need that, because you know that this is what is actually fun about your game. So it's not only about all the bad things, it's also about the good things.
These are such great and valuable points. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's a couple I wanted to dive in a little bit further on. So first and foremost, you said defining your goals. And then I want to emphasize or boil down the next point you made, which is basically focus. Now, with that focus approach, would you say that could be, and it relates a little bit to structuring questions, but would the focus be let's say each session is going to have maybe its own focus a little bit, or how can that vary? Or so is it okay to be broad, or is it okay to be focused, or does that process shift depending on where you are in the playtesting process?
I think it would be too resource and time consuming to focus on one thing for each playtest. That would be a bit too much. So you need to have multiple things that you're focusing on, but also you need to guide. If you have specific questions, you need to guide your audience and ask them, like, can you focus on the multiplayer, or can you focus on side quests and get more information about that after the playtest. But I think it's important to create a build that displays the right things. Don't have your 8-hour game as a playtest and then hope that people will go 7 hours in and notice that the boss there is like badly coded. Don't expect people to play for 8 hours. Expect them to play for a short time. So the build has to be very specifically created that, first of all, it onboards people. So they don't have to like flail around not knowing what to do. And second of all, it showcases the main gameplay mechanics that you need to test.
No, like all really good points in terms of like, you know, really setting those expectations. And I love that word you use, onboarding the players, because if you're not, if you have like poor expectations in terms of, I would say they're more almost a little bit internally, but also you need to properly convey it to your player, to the play testers as well. But like you said, if you're expecting people to try to play in as long as I can, because that could provide good feedback, it could actually distract players from the feedback you're actually looking for.
That's for sure.
And then just initial onboarding, like what is that whole, and it's kind of rhetorical here, but what does that whole process look like? Think about as if you're the player. And then that, like you said, with that onboarding, it goes back to like, not only how is it structured, but where are players going after that process? Like, is the process, is how you're having the players play and then provide feedback, is there anything throughout that process that's creating friction? Because if it is, you're getting a lot of people playing your game that might not be giving you the goal or focus, which is getting the feedback. So I love how you clarified that with saying like onboard, because that I think encompasses so much more than we typically think about. We're like, get players in and hunt them down for feedback. But well, that can be a lot harder than we would like to imagine. So, and then one more thing I want to go back to is you mentioned some really cool stuff around analyze and see patterns, see what people are saying. And this is, I find out recently with a bunch of guests we've had in the show too, and even in the past, I'm seeing these things come up more and more often, from design to all elements really, and it's coming down to the strengths and weaknesses. So it's like you called out too, like from that you can also see what players want, but is what players looking for also a strength or weakness of yours? And that could create some problems and headaches, but at least you have a better understanding on how to address those things, and maybe being creative in addressing the wants and pairing it with your own strengths, even if some of the things I do want might be a weakness of yours. But it's still important to identify, because, and you know, tell me if I'm wrong, but understanding this information could make all the difference in how the game progresses and how you market it and how resources are allocated and everything else.
Yeah, even if you don't have a thing that people want, it's good to know, because then you can position yourself. You can be very explicit in telling the users that our experience doesn't include this, but these are all the good things about our game, so you don't really need to focus on that. Players are really great at knowing what they want. They're not very great at telling you how to achieve it. Like if you look at some of the reviews and, oh, developers just need to do like this networking thing and then they can have a multiplayer. And it's like, that's not quite how it works. Like just adding multiplayer feature doesn't mean that it's going to work. You need to balance the game. You need to change game design. You need to change UI. So it is very important to understand why players are saying this. Is your game not fun because that feature is not present? Or is it because they have different expectations based on your description of the game? or you're not focusing the gameplay enough on your strengths. So having that information, what you're lacking, doesn't necessarily mean you need to build it the way they want it. You just need to know it to improve your game.
Yeah, no, and you couldn't speak any better to that, because I mean, I've worked with people too that I have seen that firsthand, and it's always those conversations. It's like, hey, is this a game? Is what players want the game we're making? And in some cases, it's like, no, it's not. So it's not like we're not going to start throwing this stuff in, because that could completely change the dynamic or the intent of this actual game. And but like you said, it's really about setting those expectations. And if there's any possibility that could be misinterpreted, then call it out. That's such a great point, because it's I think a lot of times we find ways to get that initial hook and everything. But if that hook, for some reason that we're putting into games with our marketing, doesn't align, or maybe could also include something else that the game is not, make sure that's clear, folks, because if not, it could cause more problems than you probably want to deal with.
Yeah, 100%. Because people will have these expectations put on your game that shouldn't be there. Like, if you're making an FPS game, but you hint at some sort of story, but your game doesn't have any storyline, then you will have people very disappointed in it. And then they will not recommend your game on Steam, and you will have bad rating, even though your game was never story-based. It was like very cool, fun mechanics, very exciting, fast-paced. So don't put these expectations on yourself.
Yeah.
Make sure you're very clear about what your game is. And if you see those expectations coming from people, that means there's something wrong with either your communication with the users or game design, because it pretends to be something it's not.
Yeah. Great point. So we discussed a lot in terms of this initial process. Like, there's clearly, we could boil it down into several steps here, but then there's just so much more to expound upon, to look into, to consider. So knowing this, would you have like any advice in terms of, new devs or even small teams that are kind of going about starting to play test, starting this process? Because I would imagine that everything we just talked about to some people can be kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, I think it is a bit overwhelming. There's no easy way to play test. I think you can just start with writing a 10-question survey, having at least 30-minute demo, and having some community to play test it. Then you have very clear feedback. Once you get that feedback, you can categorize it, especially if you have open questions. You can see, how many people had a positive sentiment about UI, how many had negative examples. Same with like game mechanics. So you can boil it down to very specific tasks. So like we had a client that got feedback that their map was unintuitive, and they had suggestions of like doing a 2D map, because they had a 3D map, a 2D map, or like a mini map. And they listened that the map is unintuitive. They didn't listen to the suggestions. They boiled it down into very clear task to make their map easier to understand. So they added waypoints, they made a 2D feel to the map so it's clear. But you need to make sure that you turn your feedback into tasks. Don't just look at it and think, oh, they don't like it or they like it. It's not about liking or disliking. It's what can you do with that feedback. And definitely setting up the playtest is going to be hard, and recruiting players is going to be hard. But start doing it as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I love how you really simplified this process. Again, there's a lot that can go into it, but I mean, 10-question survey. That to some people, I'm sure that may be short, but the reality of it is too, what's the friction look like? Like 10 questions, I'm sure most people are going to have more time to answer 10 questions than there are going to be 30 questions, right? especially if you're not some hot new beta tester for like a Square Enix game, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they can get a little get away more with a big name title or AAA could probably get away with a little bit more questions. But the reality is, yeah. So and I love and even being, but I think more importantly, or just as important, is how are those questions actionable? How is the feedback from those questions actionable? Because there's nothing worse than trying to like filter this as like, okay, what does this really mean in terms of what do I do next? Because and again, that insight goes back to the other points we were talking about is like, hey, what are things to not just scale this type of stuff, but also reduce resources and costs and help prioritize things. Well, if you're very direct and focused with the types of questions and make sure the responses can be turned into tasks, that is a great way to do that, as you have already outlined a little bit earlier. And then let me ask you this. Is there any particular reason, and it might go back to what you said earlier about don't expect players to play for 7 hours, but is there any particular reason to focus like that 30-minute mark for a playtest?
So 30 minutes is definitely short enough to keep players' attention. If you go under that, I don't think you can have a comprehensive experience. Some games have like 20-minute demos that are comprehensive, but 30 minutes is a good time. Ideally, you want around an hour so to see where people start dropping off. So if people play under 10 minutes, and like majority of people play under 10 minutes, then you see you need to improve your tutorial or like initial part of the game. But if you see that people keep playing, you know that it hooks the player. So 30 minutes is like the minimum. Ideally, you want over an hour to see how many people keep playing over the 30-minute mark.
Okay. And, I think that's important to, and I'm glad you further outlined that because, again, we were phrasing this as like, hey, people starting out, teams, whoever with this process and trying to really hone it in a little bit more. 30 minutes is obviously a good mark to hit, but getting it to the hour point and making sure there's, obviously enough content and everything so they can play up to an hour is probably good because if they want more, but you're only giving them 30 minutes worth, then there could be a lot other valuable insight and feedback you could receive within that time. So, but we understand too that, hey, for whatever reason, with what resources you have, your team size, et cetera, 30 minutes might be all that you can get. So you cannot do other stuff outside of just doing nothing but development. So I love how you define that further. So folks, make it a goal of trying to get an hour of playtime. 30 minutes is great, but an hour can be so much more revealing. And I think straightforward what you said about the community. If there's some level of community that you have, whether you have started it or again, like you said, old community, that's probably a good place. But those 3 points, those 10 question survey, just to throw a number out there. Obviously we don't have to just pinpoint on 10, but it sounds like a great place to position and start with 30 to 60 minutes and some community are some great ways to start. If this is a new process for you as a solo developer or a small team. So really appreciate that. Now, we're going to come to close here in a moment. And I know you already provided some tips and suggestions, but if you, out of everything we discussed today, what are let's say the top 2 or 3 that you would think of that are most important and people should consider from our conversation today?
I always say that the most important thing is setting your goals. Don't just playtest because it's a thing people do. Playtest because you know what you're asking your users. And the second thing is, I would say, understand that playtesting can help you prioritize the right things. It's not an expense that is going to just take your time. It can give you more information that you can work with when deciding your development times. So it can actually save you time and budget if you playtest.
These are so good and so simple. Doesn't mean that they're easy to define, but they are at least simple in identifying and then being able to explore further. So folks, setting your goals and also understand that, playtesting can help you prioritize the right things. And as we already outlined, very, very important stuff in terms of how it looks like to your dev cycle, how it looks like, how are these things, if not considered, how if you're not prioritizing these things because of this information, then how does that push off other stuff? And like you said, there's so many times when it's like, oh, we thought it would take us 2 months or 2 weeks, and now it's taking us 2 months. And then you might have other campaigns or things going on that need to get pushed back now. And when sometimes waiting can be beneficial, but in other times, waiting also means opportunity costs, resource costs. There's so many other factors there. And hey, it's a tricky business, but so is a lot of things, right? But still, really great points that you laid out there. Can't thank you enough for those. So as we get ready to close here, there's so many things that we talked about it's really cool because everything that Agne, well, not necessarily what you do specifically with your role at G Round, but what G Round represents and everything is a lot of what we discussed today. And I would love you to share a little bit more information about this too. What's really exciting too for me, folks, doing this podcast is when I had preliminary discussions with Agne about this coming on the show. It was really cool because I was already familiar with G-Round because I've had several clients that have used the service and couldn't speak highly enough of how valuable this whole process was for them. But I'm not going to talk about their stories. I just really want Agne to kind of share what G-Round is and what it provides and how it relates to everything we discussed today. So if you could, Agne, just share a little bit about G-Round, what it is, and then afterwards, let's talk about that offer.
Yes. So G-Round is a playtesting platform for PC games. We have an amazing community. Some of them been with us for 3 years already. They're just regular gamers who want to play the games, want to be part of the development process, share their opinion, feedback. We've created a very intuitive platform where users sign up and they participate in public tests where they play the game, write a review, rate different parts of the game like story, replayability, game idea. They answer survey questions, post gameplay videos that let you understand better if your UI is intuitive or do people go the way you expect them to. And we help you analyze all that. So we do everything from recruitment to analysis to take off your plate. We started doing private testing last week, which means we have almost 400 players under NDA. That's mostly for bigger developers and publishers that cannot do public tests. And it's still the same quality players who leave very constructive feedback. It's not like just good game or I hate it. It's a lot more structured and longer that you can make very good data-driven decisions out of, because our tests are larger scale. Our public playtest starts at 500 players and private test starts at 100 players. So you don't have just like 2, 5, 10 people saying their own opinion. You can actually start seeing patterns.
Yeah, and folks, I mean, services like this, like G-Round, are so valuable. And because let's think of it, even if you decide to go and what might seem like a different route or a simpler route of reaching out individually to people or throwing your trailer or 30-second clip up at Destroy My Game on Reddit, which is very valuable, but it's such a bite-sized piece of this big puzzle when you're trying to figure out these things. And a service like G-Round really streamlines that process, really makes it simple. And if there's one thing that we talked about in terms of cost savings and everything else that playtesting provides, going through a service such as this is in itself by default cost saving. And not only just from the any costs that are associated with your business and with the development, but also just your mental stability. The fact that you could get so overwhelmed, these things are so structured and confined, and the time savings alone is probably very valuable for you and how it also dictates your project. So can't emphasize this enough. And again, this isn't just the fact that Agne is here with us today discussing it. It's also because I've had firsthand experience with clients that have shared the same thing with myself and saying how valuable it was, how it verified everything we talked about previously, and how it's so helpful for them to make those next steps that are they're confident in their decisions and they're also effective by taking those course of action. So, Agne, thanks again for sharing all that. And enough of me. What is this offer? What is this opportunity that our listeners have? That G Round can potentially provide.
So, if you're an indie developer, which let's define indie, you're not like 100 people team that is just releasing games independently. But if you're a smaller team and don't have a publisher, you're able to apply for our indie support program, which means you can get a completely free playtest, full service, including players, analysis, and community that you can talk to. So all our requirements are at least 30-minute gameplay, fun game, because you are up against all the other games that get submitted. Mm-hmm. No offensive language or visuals, no hate crime, no nothing like that. We're very friendly people. And ideally, you want a game that is easily streamable because we have a lot of smaller influencers and community members that make videos. So it adds extra points, but that's not mandatory. So if you want to join this indie support program, submit your game on developer.gameround.co. There's a submission form. We will playtest it internally. And if you're successful, you're going to get an email from us. We're going to set a date. You get a full playtest for free.
I absolutely love that you guys do this and have this program because, we all know that, time and resources, especially funds, can be limited. But the fact that you're able to offer some opportunities like this one, so that way, people in those situations, teams in those situations, also have a chance at opportunities like this is awesome. So again, can't thank you enough for, extending that opportunity to our listeners and folks. There's no need for me to say anything else about this. At the very least, apply, go check out the indie support program. I think if you're at the stage of development, where that person that you tapped your buddy or whoever on the shoulder say, hey, it's ready, then that just means that you're also ready to at least consider checking out G Round and applying for the indie support program if you meet those requirements, which I would imagine most of you do. But if you don't, if for whatever you're in a different space, hey, shout out to your friends, shout out to your colleagues who could use something like this, because it would be a valuable experience, whether you're accepted in that program or not. Again, it speaks volumes. Again, I can't thank you enough for being here today, to sharing all this insight, such valuable information as we, talk about playtesting as a whole. So you did drop a link before. Please mention again, how can people connect and get in touch?
So we have our developer website called developer.gameround.co, or you can just email me at agne@gameround.co. It's like CO, it's not com. It's don't mix it up.
Awesome. And anything else like social media, or those are the two main things that you would recommend?
I think these are the best ones. Our social media is difficult to find.
That's fine.
If you go on, if you find you on Twitter, which I apparently don't know the handle of. Oh, it's gameround.co.
Gameround.co.
That's our Twitter. If our DMs are open, so you're more than welcome to DM us, and one of my colleagues will get back to you and send you the link for submission if you can't find it yourself. And you can ask questions there. Or you can find me on Twitter. I'm Agne Vitkute. There's not many of those. So
Awesome.
if you just search for that, you'll find me.
Yeah, and folks, will definitely include that in the show notes, which will be a link in the description wherever you're listening to the podcast. So check it out, reach out, talk to Agne if you have any questions, or wherever you contact. Again, totally worth reaching out if you're ready for playtesting. So again, Agne, I can't thank you enough so much for being on the show, sharing your stuff, and yeah, it was great having you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.